Now, generations. These are three of the founders of a fantastic film and photography collective that started in 1968. This is the first generation in the UK, the people who started community arts in Britain. They're called Amber Collective, and they still exist. They have been a collective for 47 years, and I think in the neoliberal world we live in, that's pretty impressive. People have come and gone, their work has changed, they have been faced with some very difficult times, they've had their funds cut because they wouldn't change what they wanted to do. They have done extraordinary work. But what I really want to tell you about is what the meaning of the generations is. This is a still from one of their first films. It was called The Launch. They work in Newcastle and the northeast of England. When they went there was still a shipbuilding industry. So they'd already been there 6 years and they were making a film about the launch of a ship on the Tyne. And these people at the bottom are the shipbuilders. This is an image from a recent exhibition, and now what they're documenting is the survival of a post-industrial society. What you can see in the background, the lit up, looks a bit like a tent in an oasis. It's a shopping centre. It's built on the sign of a former mine. And the miners, these are their allotments. So these are people who have been through the historic changes of the last 50 years, and their ideas were formed and have changed in that time. And of course, they are working in different ways to people who are starting out today. So that's a generational change. It makes a really big difference if you started, when you started. And a third example to talk about, to show how the context of the artistic vision can be so important. This is a group I first got to know in 1998. A group run by two remarkable artists, Alvaro Restrepo, who's a Colombian dancer and artist, and a French educator, dance educator called Marie-France de Lieuvin. They started completely, hopefully, with a project in 1997 where they invited young kids from Cartagena, which is on the Colombian coast, to take part in contemporary dance, and out of that they selected 16 who they called them the Pilot Experimental Group. Since then they have been going on. That group have become, not all of them, but they have become the dancers, they've become a professional dance company, and they have become the trainers of the next generation. So the young man that you can see at the front was one of the youngsters in the first group. They're called El Colegio del Cuerpo, the school of the body, because Alvaro has a fantastic vision to teach and educate young people about their body in every sense. So they're trying to teach them about nutrition, they're trying to teach them about sexual health, they're trying to teach them about violence in a society where many of these children have moved to Cartagena as refugees from civil war, where there is domestic violence as a very common occurrence. But they're also trying to teach them about the creative and artistic potential, if you like, the spirituality of the body and why it's so important. This photograph I took because for me it was a shock to realise, brought me home to realise that you cannot work with children for 3 hours in dance unless you feed them at the end of the session, because these children cannot spend that amount of energy. There's nowhere are they going to get it back unless you give it back to them. And they came to York. I was lucky to be able to bring them to York, and they did a week of workshops, fantastic workshops in Britain. And I took them on the 1 day, free day. I took them to visit York, beautiful old city. And what was wonderful, we went into this church and they got talking to the people who were looking after the church, and they said, what do you do? And they said, oh, we're dancers. And they said, oh, really? And they said, we'll show you. And they just did a Korean court dance for the 3 people in the church to show them. And I love that confidence, that artistic vision. It's you couldn't replicate it. Nobody else could do what Alvaro and Marie-France have done in Colombia because they're not Marie-France and Alvaro. They have a vision, and you shouldn't try to do that. You have to do your own thing. But that is why we have such a diversity of practice and projects. Now, I want to say a little bit about diversity of purpose, and I'm conscious that I told Siko I rewrote this talk about 3 times. I was very conscious that I'm talking to people who know an enormous amount about community arts, and I have to tell you something that I hope you don't already know or haven't thought of, or at least show you some pictures you haven't seen before. And then I'm also talking to people who may not know very much about community arts at all. So this talk is far too big, and I may just have to abandon parts of it. But I want to try and talk about the diversity of purpose. So the first really big question for me is, if you're an artist and you're working in this field, what is not negotiable about your work? And I think the first choice is, are you driven by social change, or are you driven by creating art? And every artist that I ask that question of says, I do both. Okay, I accept that. Of course, all of these projects do both. But in the end, you have to know who you are as a person and as an artist. And I think the choice you have to ask yourself is, if I could get outstanding social results by abandoning the artistic aspect of my project and just doing a good community development project, but I would guarantee a fantastic transformational project with the people I'm working with, would I abandon the art? And equally, if the project was going to turn out to be the most artistically exciting project, but actually nobody was really going to benefit from it socially, although they might benefit from it artistically, would I choose that? Would I make that choice? Because in the end, although the projects always have that dual, double purpose, which is what makes them restless and what makes them interesting, at the same time, you have to know who you really are. And I'll come back to why that matters, maybe in a little bit. Mm-hmm. If you are convinced that you are an artist, that in the end you are not motivated by producing social change, and that whatever happens, you are not going to abandon your artistic vision, then I think there is a question about who has control. I have watched in the last 15 years more and more artists from the contemporary art world, visual artists from the contemporary art world, and artists from the performing art world starting to work with people and describing their work as participatory. I am not always comfortable with that work. Sometimes it's good, sometimes I think it's questionable. Sometimes I think people are in effect being treated by artists as material that can be used to construct the work that the artist is wanting to do. And so there is a tension here between the control being with the artist or with people. And here are 2 examples that illustrate what I mean. And this is a project I saw in Bristol, it finished probably only a couple of weeks ago. It's by an American artist called Feaster Gates, and he called it Sanctum. He built this structure out of recycled materials in the ruins of a medieval church in Bristol. And his idea then was that for 24 days, 24 hours a day, this building that he's made would be filled with the noise of creative people in Bristol. So it's cut up into hour-long slots, and people were invited to come. And when I went to see it, there was an a cappella group who had just finished singing. You can see them putting away their instruments there. And then there was a group of potters who were about to start making some pottery, and there was a recording of people who'd worked in pottery. Now, you can think this is interesting or not. It's not the point. What I'm really saying is, in my way of thinking, this is not community art. This is an artist making a work that will be part of his catalogue, will be written about by critics as a work by Thies de Gates. Sorry, I have to check his name because I didn't know it. But it will be written up by art critics as that. This is a project I worked on in the early 2000s. This is a program called Living Heritage, where we worked in several countries in Eastern Europe. This is a village in northern Bulgaria called Oresh. We didn't go there because it had a problem. We went there, when I say we were working with Bulgarian partners. They visited villages and they talked to people and they said, we're doing this program, do you want to be part of it? There was no conditions to that. But of course there were problems, and we did discover the problem. But we didn't ask them about the problem, we asked them about what they were proud of. And what they were proud of in this village was the traditional Catholic culture. It's one of only half a dozen villages in Bulgaria which are Catholic, as opposed to Orthodox or Unitarian or other culture. But nobody remembered the Catholic culture except the grandparents, because under the Soviet period it had been gradually suppressed. So they said, we want to revive that. And then out of that came the problem that they had a lot of young people in the village who had nothing to do, and they were causing problems, the older people felt, and also the older people were frightened of them. So out of that came naturally a project which brought together the grandparent generation and the young people's generation. They revived a traditional dance group. The dance group was so popular with the youngsters that they had to make two dance groups. The youngsters and the grandparents all got to know each other. The atmosphere in the village changed. They ended up doing a festival for all the Catholic villages in northern Bulgaria. A transformative thing. But is it part of our story? Absolutely not. Did we know we were going to do it before it happened? Absolutely not. The point about this project is the people that you can see in this photograph are the world experts in the culture of Oresh. Nobody knows more about it than them. That gives them a position of power in the project which is unequaled. And it means that me, as an artist, or the other people working on the project, all we can do is help them. We can help them to learn how to run a project. That's all. Those are the skills we can bring. And we can talk to them about some of the things we've seen elsewhere that said, well, that was tried here and it caused these problems. So maybe you might want to think about that. So that's, if you like, the alternatives of a project which is in the control of the community of the people, or a project which is in the control of the artist. Now, within the field that I would call community arts, where the work is more or less is on the side of being in the control of the people. Of course, it's not black and white in this case. It's somewhere along the spectrum. I want to touch on three objectives that I think artists and arts organisations have. One objective is to give people access to art. Lots of people, we think, don't have access to art. I think that's true if you think art is what happens in buildings like this. As it happens, I've never met anybody who didn't have an artistic life. I never met anybody who didn't like some kinds of art and not like others. But whether those kinds of art are everything is another matter. So the first thing is a lot of our policy is about access to art. The second is about social change, which I think is stronger in the Netherlands and maybe than it is in Britain. And the third, which is the bit that interests me most, is about cultural rights.